one of his periodic takes on the transatlantic security challenges. This event is co-sponsored by the London School's two centers, the Center for International Strategy, Technology and Policy, and the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies. CETS is a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence sponsored by the European Union's Erasmus Plus program. Nothing General Breedlove says can in any way be attributed to the European Commission or the European Union. I'm sure he wouldn't have it any other way. Bill Breedlove is a highly decorated retired general of the United States Air Force, where he reached the highest levels of military leadership, as Supreme Allied Commander Europe, SACEUR, and the Commander of U.S. European Command. He served in those dual roles from 2013 to 2016. He is also a graduate of Georgia Tech in civil engineering. General Breedlove, welcome. We look forward to your remarks.
Alistair, thank you very much. You stole my most favorite line, which is in the bottom left-hand corner of that slide is my most important bona fides, and that is I got out in '77. But I'm really glad to be back at the school. Some of you have been through this conversation with me before, so hopefully today's format will help you not be bored with the way we're going to proceed. Next slide, please. The first thing to get out today is where my head is about NATO. There's a lot of talking out there, and sometimes it's a part of election rhetorics and other things, but to me, NATO has never been more important than it is today. I ask you, I'm not going to give you the numbers I have, I ask you to Google the costs of World War I and World War II in millions of lives, in blood and treasure, in the impact on world economy and certainly European economies. And so I have to ask us all to consider, what is avoiding the next war worth? When we look at what we're spending today to try to maintain deterrence and keep the peace, what is that in relation to the staggering amount of lives lost and cost to economies of those wars? And many people sort of look at disdain on this concern that we're watching and maintaining deterrence and spending money on being ready in case we need to employ. And they argue, we're not going to have another war like that. I would opine differently. History is not over. It doesn't take much reflection to think about what happened in Georgia in 2008 and what remains today. What happened twice in Ukraine during the spring of 14 when I was the SACEUR. What's going on right now in Nagorno-Karabakh, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And all the other myriad of places where conflict continues today in the European setting, not to mention the Middle East and others, Syria, Libya, what went on multiple times with murders in the streets of London by operatives of other nationalities, what we see happening in our American elections, et cetera, et cetera. I just would offer that history is not over. We need to be ready, and NATO's more important than it's ever been. Next slide, please. So some of you, I said, have been with me before, and I sort of do the tour de disaster, starting in the Arctic and ending up in Northern Africa. And so what I want to do today is just briefly retouch a lot of things that we've all been watching for some time now. And then we'll go on to some very, not so very new, but some new implications in some conflicts in the Euro-Asian landmass. Russia continues to be a challenge. If you just look in the north, opposite the three Baltic nations and the military garrison at Pskov, essentially their equivalent of our 101st Airborne, their most ready airborne capable military unit, only 40 minutes flying time from the capitals of the Baltic nations, two of them. And look at how that force and other forces have acted in the last two Zapad exercises. Remembering that the Russian exercise Zapad, the word means west, and the orientation of those exercises is quote unquote defending in the West. However, we see over and over again the Zapad exercise demonstrating offensive capabilities. We see gray zone actions continuing with Russia, as NATO likes to call it, hybrid warfare, or as Gerasimov, the leader of the Russian military, talks about indirect means, asymmetric methods. All of these things that we see playing out in the West today, and most importantly right now, how it is playing out in the U.S. elections, how these influence campaigns, how these fake news stories are used to incite the public on both sides of the problem. And I would opine to you, my place in this is that Russia is neither trying to elect either of the candidates. Russia is just trying to discredit American democracy and discredit the U.S. election systems. We see a new challenge on the map in front of you in that gap between Greenland, Iceland, and the UK. We call that the GUIC gap, Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. And the new naval capabilities coming out of the Bastion Sea area into the north of Russia that now challenges transatlantic passage of our military forces. This is the reason that NATO is changing right now and standing up Strategic Command Atlantic, changing the old Norfolk Command, which primarily was a staffing command before. Now, not only do they have those normal development of transformational ideas, but they now are picking up a military mission, and that is centered on and also aided by the U.S. Second Fleet out of Norfolk, which now has the mission of fighting across the Atlantic so that we can reinforce Europe if we need to. Russia has watched and seen what happens if the West is allowed to reinforce and build up military capability and then go to employing it. And so they have once again put emphasis on interdiction at sea, and what we used to consider to be a peaceful passage if we needed to go to Europe now is contested in the least, as the least position. Definitely contested if we are trying to reinforce Europe. And then finally, on Russia, while there are other subjects to discuss, and we'll touch them, a couple of them in a minute, the Black Sea. The Black Sea has become a new area of conflict and strife. As you know, NATO allies on the western coast of the Black Sea, and Ukraine, as you can see on the map, to the northern part of the Black Sea, with the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea there, which now is occupied by Russia, as well as the southeast corner of Ukraine, known as the Donbass, occupied by forces that are enabled, paid, and supplied by Russia to hold those lands in the Donbass around Lugansk and Donetsk by the separatists there. And so the Black Sea has become an issue. And then we watched just not too long ago play out that the Russians seized Ukrainian sailors who were trying to operate in and out of the Sea of Azov. The Sea of Azov, which is the small sea to the northeast side of Crimea, southeast side of Ukraine, is incredibly important because the port of Mariupol, which is where almost all of Ukraine's agricultural product goes out through that port, through the Kerch Straits to the east of Crimea. And we have seen Russia build a bridge across the Kerch Straits. That bridge was built at purpose too short for most large cargo ships to go under it. So Russia has set a limitation physically on Mariupol. And then Russia has harassed shipping in that lane, and as we said before, seized a boat and seized Ukrainian sailors in that areas, making the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov to the north part of the Black Sea, the Kerch Strait and Crimea, a continuing problem with Russia. Second, many of you in the Sam Nunn School have talked a lot about nuclear arms control, and we are blessed to have Senator Nunn, who worries about these things all the time, as our namesake. And of course, recently the United States stepped out of the INF Treaty. I think that's an unfortunate characterization of what has happened because, as we all know, Russia had abrogated this treaty many years before with their actions. We were the only people in the treaty, and so it was basically defunct in any case. But we need a treaty like this. We need to now step into conversations so that we can address the intermediate nuclear forces and control any growth in that or a possible arms race in that in Europe. And then, of course, START. We need to work to keep our START agreement and build on that and possibly begin to try to talk about how we can involve other people like China in these kinds of agreements, both intermediate and long-range weapons, are strategic weapons in the future. We've talked a lot about Ukraine already as I was talking about the Black Sea, but let's just examine how the Normandy format led by the French and the Germans is working, how the Minsk agreement is being accomplished. The Minsk format for the agreement has been accomplished. Remembering that, and you may in the Q&A take umbrage with me, but the main endeavor now that the fighting has been drawn down, there's still fighting out there, and people are still dying on the line of contact. But after we have got the fighting settled down, the number one endeavor of this Normandy format and Minsk is to return control of the Ukrainian border to the Ukrainian people. Right now, Russia controls a large part of the southeast corner of Ukraine's border, and Ukraine has no idea what's going in and out of there. You might remember the famous white truck convoys, which were seen or they were said to be relief supplies, and we all now know were primarily military supplies to supply the fighting in the southeast there. But we have had precious little progress in the Normandy format and the Minsk agreements to try to return that border to Ukraine so that Ukraine can begin to once again act as a nation along its borders in control of its sovereign territory. The militarization of Crimea continues. There are nuclear capable systems there. There have been, even in the public, intimations that nuclear weapons could be there or not be there, could be exercised there or not be there, all sending a message to the West in what Crimea means. The anti-access area denial, that's A2AD, on Crimea literally controls it to some degree the northeast 75% of the Black Sea. The surface-to-air missiles are a little shorter. The surface-to-surface missiles are a little longer. The coastal defense cruise missiles that are in there are of a different varying length. So to some degree, Russia is able to affect all actions in essentially the northeast 2/3 to 75% of that ocean. And that anti-access area denial becomes a point of consternation between Russia and NATO. We in the United States have flown aircraft through that denied airspace. And you've seen some of the antics with Russian fighters, what we call bumping, flying up in front of and other things of the aircraft. some of the encounters in the sea, targeting radars being locked on ships, et cetera, et cetera. So we in the West, to include NATO, but certainly the United States, have been flying and sailing freedom of navigation missions to demonstrate to the world and to Russia that the Black Sea is not a Russian backyard. It is an international body of water open for commerce for all involved. And we've already talked about the Kerch Strait. My closing thought will be a bit controversial. I try to remain unpolitical, apolitical in how I do business. But as a military man, as the commander of U.S. European Command, who I'm wearing the patch today, and as the NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe, I have watched the last 12 years of the United States slowly retrenching from Europe, slowly removing ourselves from leadership positions, slowly trying to hand this over to others. And I think that it's important maybe today that we take stock of how that has turned out for us and the new strife that we see in these waters, land areas, and seas. So that will be hopefully part of our questions and answers. Okay, so that is an overview of things that have been going on and some of you and I have talked about before. Let's now move to some specific old but new things that I think we need to address. Next slide, please. The first one is the Arctic. We have talked about this, but it changes almost consistently. The Arctic has been a point of concern now since we've started to see the retrenchment of the ice and the opening of a passage that goes from northwest or north central Europe around the north of Russia and into Asia. Remember that we have talked about how this opens up for the average sort of vessel. Some are more, some are less, but for the average sort of commercial vessel, this is nominally 14 days faster to sail this northern route than it is to go around through Gibraltar, through the Med, through the canal, out the ditch, through the Malacca Straits, and all the other things you have to do to get to Asia from Europe. And so it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that if it goes 14 days there faster and comes back 14 days faster when it comes back, how much more commerce can be turned, how much more these ships can be used, how much more money and profit there is in the movement, how much more opportunity to move goods, etc. So this passage is incredibly important. You can take your own stock of my appraisal. What I have seen is Russia sort of flip and flop now on what this means. Initially, I think we all saw this as an opportunity. And Russia probably saw this as an opportunity to increase their commerce and possibly collect tariffs or whatever they had in mind to sail through their waters, what they claim as their waters that appear between in this new northern passage. Pretty quickly after the discussion of this being an opportunity came the discussion in Russia that this is a security challenge. How are they going to be able to be sovereign in what they saw in their waters? And so we saw a steady investment over about 18 months in the airfields, the naval facilities, and infrastructure in the north. We saw a buildup in these military capabilities along the northern edge of the land. This was said by Russia to be, normal and supporting commerce, supporting sensing, supporting search and rescue, and frankly, maybe that was part of the impetus to do this. But certainly what we saw is a challenge in that there became a militarization of the northern shore of Russia in order to exert influence into these waters. Shortly thereafter, and I'm a civil engineer from Georgia Tech, so this is something that's incredibly intriguing to me. We saw challenges in the north for Russia as the permafrost starts to melt, and the basis for some of their infrastructure turns from hard, solid soil to muck, not supporting the infrastructure. You know, think about buildings sagging away from buildings, what that does to everything from septic and sewer lines to electric lines to connectivity, et cetera, et cetera. And the infrastructure supporting the petrochemical industry was being challenged severely by the changing dynamic of this melting permafrost. Oh, by the way, most of the very cold weather gear that Russia uses in its high north are bought in Houston, Texas. And so now we have a dwindling supply, a problem with the infrastructure, and possibly a problem with the supplier of some of the equipment that is used in these places. There was at a time, and I still believe it is, but now you see some pundits writing that the importance of the icebreaker fleet is diminishing because the ice is receding in such a way that the time that the waters are open and you don't need an icebreaker is growing all the time. This is something I think requires a little introspection by scholars to determine what we really think. But this is also being discussed out there. And so Russia now has gone through a time where they're seeing that this vast supply of gas and oil is being challenged by the change in the environment, the melting of the permafrost, and at the same time, the opening of the Northern Passage is more open. And as we'll talk about now for China, China is challenging that passage. So why would we talk about China right now? First and foremost is they are desperate to be an Arctic nation. They have been trying to literally buy territory in the north. Not rent or lease it, but buy it so they can fly a Chinese flag and become a part of the Atlantic Council and start helping to develop those policies and regulations of how we do business in the Arctic. They have recently declared themselves a near Arctic nation. Pretty clear their intentions. And China has challenged Russia in the north. As many of you know, just a little over a year ago, sailing through there with a Chinese icebreaker and a Chinese commercial vessel in waters that they believe are outside the normal international norms, saying that we are now in international waters. Of course, Russia is claiming much farther out as they attempt to influence this part of the world. So as you see, the Arctic is not new, but there's some very new dynamics, and this is only going to get worse. Whatever you believe about climate change, the ice is receding. And as the ice recedes, opportunities and challenges arise depending on who you are and how you look. And it is clear that Russia asserts sovereignty in more water than is customary, and it is also clear that there are other nations in the world that are going to challenge those assertions. Okay, next slide, please. The next new but not so new challenge, Belarus. You can see it on the map there, just to the east of Poland and south of the three Baltic nations, and just to the west of the central part of Russia. You have been following this, so there's not going to be a lot new here, but I think we need to think about impact. Is the Lukashenka regime legitimate? Most would say no. Most would say we've just had a fraudulent election. Most would point to the massive rallies and demonstrations that have been ongoing since August the 9th to say that this is an illegitimate regime repressing the peace-loving people of Belarus. I'm using some of the emotive language that you see in the papers and things now. Lukashenko is seen as a brutal dictator. But the real question is, what is next? What is behind him? And the grand fear of many is that if Lukashenko goes, then there will be a much more Russian-friendly replacement community behind them. And so I think this is something we need to consider. I put in the bottom set of bullets there a word that might cause some of you to gag. The West looks at Lukashenko as a leader who actually in some ways stands up to Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin has for some time been trying to convince Belarus to allow more permanent Russian stationing of troops. And Mr. Lukashenko has pushed back on that and has been seen by some in the West as a way to moderate Russian aspiration close to NATO boundaries. So is he a leader? He talks all the time about avoiding an occupation force, and he sort of occasionally intimates what has happened in Transnistria and the Russian garrisons that remain there in Moldova, and how that would look and might cause problems for his government in his country. We all know that Lukashenko wants to enjoy both sides. He's clearly absolutely dependent on Russia for trade, for energy, to some degree for certain types of funding and tariffs, et cetera, et cetera. But he keeps leaning to the West, trying to enjoy some of the associations with the West. And in leaning to the West, he knows he needs to keep more depth of Russian direction inside of his country under control. And finally, as we see the pod exercises and other exercises, Mr. Lukashenko has been a very good governor, if you will use the mechanical term, to try to avoid large Russian troop formations in his country that might stay and set up again an operation much like we see in Transnistria and Moldova. And so Belarus remains a challenge. I think we would all agree that the government and the elections may not be perfect, and that in a Western sense, we would like to see a more representative, democratic, honest, law and order type organization. But we also worry about a Russian marionette or puppet in to follow. And so Belarus remains a new and somewhat even more focused concern to us now. Next slide, please. Of course, we now watch Nagorno-Karabakh. Go back one just real quick and let's make sure everybody knows where this is on the map. Go back one slide. I had to trim my slides down a little bit to get them to work. Chris, there we go. So if you look in the north and east of Turkey, on the east edge of the Black Sea, south of Russia, you see there Azerbaijan and Armenia. Now go forward. And this is a close-up now. So let's start with the map on the bottom of the slide first. So here is Armenia in the west, Azerbaijan in the east. And the things to really talk about here are the three border nations of Russia, Iran, and Turkey. We will also talk just a bit about Georgia because they are offering to help in this process. But Russia to the north, Iran to the south, Turkey to the west. And then in the middle of that slide is the Nagorno-Karabakh region. And this land, which you now look at in the north, in the slide in the top right corner, the picture in the top right corner, this Nagorno-Karabakh region is Azerbaijan that was occupied and has long been held by Armenia. And so you have displaced peoples in Nagorno-Karabakh. Not only displaced peoples, but you have the difference between an Orthodox religion and a Muslim religion juxtaposed there. And so the picture in the north is literally 1 day old. If you look at the outside edges of Nagorno-Karabakh, which would be the grayish color in the west, and in the north, the pink and the green, outside the pink and the green, that was the original boundaries of Nagorno-Karabakh when this recent conflict erupted. The green areas are areas that Azerbaijan absolutely has recaptured and is in control of. The pink areas are the last 2 to 3 days of fighting, the contested zones. And some of these zones are extremely mountainous, and the fighting right now is pretty amazing. So this is not a new war. In 96, they had the 4-day war, and a lot of people were killed then. And every day since then, this line continues to be contested. But now we're in the middle of a new hot war where many more people have died and lots of armored equipment and military equipment has been destroyed. This is not a dust up. This is not something trivial. Men, women, civilians, and armored formations are being destroyed in this fight right now. It is a hot war inside. We're now on, I think, our third attempt at a ceasefire. 2 put forward by Russia. One of them only lasted hours. And now one that was brokered by the United States, and it appears it has faltered as well. Why are we concerned about Nagorno-Karabakh? I pointed it out to you before a few minutes ago. Let's look again to the map in the bottom of this slide. To the north, Russia. To the south, Iran. And to the southwest, Turkey. 3 regional powers, certainly, if not international powers, to be contended with in this area. All 3 involved for their own reasons. And in a couple of cases, those reasons are all about making money by selling arms. In fact, Russia sells arms to both sides and are profiteering, if you will, from this conflict. And if you listen to learned scholars, they will tell you that Russia doesn't really want to see this conflict end. They just want it to be smoldering because that's their best way to influence what goes on there and to continue to sell arms. And so there's impetus there actually not to solve this problem, as well as there is impetus to solve the problem. And so a major concern for many is that we have the potential for major regional, if not international powers to come into conflict. Turkey has been training and equipping Azerbaijan from officer to NCO, non-commissioned officer, or enlisted troops. Turkey is involved in Azerbaijan. Some of the most sophisticated drone or remotely piloted aircraft warfare we've seen to date has happened here, and many Russian-supplied Armenian tanks and armored personnel carriers have been destroyed by Turkish drones in this area. Israel also selling high-end equipment to Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan, unlike Armenia, whose economy has been fairly stagnant, has not been able to invest in their military. They had a big, very capable Russian-supplied military. But Azerbaijan, whose economy is incrementally better, they have been investing for almost 10 years, buying high-end capability from Israel, from Turkey, from others in the area. And they have brought that capability to bear. And that's why you see these big gains and regains of Azerbaijani land in the top picture. And so we have now the next level of worrisome intervention. We see Russia actually intervening on this northern border, allowing the Armenians to strike into Azerbaijani area and then retreat behind the Russians so that that the Azerbaijanis can't follow them and extract a price for these kinds of actions. And on the Iranian border, we see that Iran has put out large concrete blocking pieces in the major roads, again in hilly area where you can't just go around things. And then when the Azerbaijanis try to remove the concrete blocks, they come under fire. We believe at this point that the Iranians have not killed anybody, and maybe they don't even intend to. But what they are saying is, if you go out and try to remove these blocks that we've put in the road, you are at risk. And so we see now the Russians and the Iranians much more directly being involved in the fighting here, and that is a large concern. To date, as we mentioned, I am aware of 3 attempts at bringing a ceasefire or peace, 2 by the Russians. Again, both have failed, and 1 by us, which appears to have failed, and the fighting is back on. And so this is going to be a continuing issue. And once again, much like we have seen in Ukraine, we see the Minsk process, of which we, the United States, are supposed to be a part of. The Minsk process has not made the progress, at least the permanent progress, that we need. And learned pundits have opined that until both the United States and Russia and possibly a few other leaders come together to put pressure on this, we won't see these peace overtures hold. So it's going to take more than Minsk to get this to where we need it. Next slide, please. And I got 5 minutes before I need to go to questions. So Turkey. First of all, the issues in Turkey are also not new. Mr. Erdogan, I heard called the other day by a great speaker, is the anti-Ataturk, remembering that Ataturk brought a secular Turkey and put the army in charge of keeping the country secular. And now we see the demise of the secular state, and we see Mr. Erdogan ushering in what I have heard him describe as political Islam. And now we see how that has changed Turkey's approach to the world. But we need to remember that Turkey is an important NATO ally. Important for a lot of reasons. I love this saying that real estate people use when they're selling a house. They say location, location, location. Well, let me opine to you as a military man and a former commander of NATO and a commander of U.S. European Command. The geostrategic position of Turkey is critical. They're critical to our ability to do things into the Middle East, and they're critical to bringing stability to everything from the Balkans to the Caucasus. This corner of the world has been problematic throughout history. And the stability of a great NATO ally, geo-positioned as Turkey is incredibly important to the world and to NATO. Oh, by the way, they are the second largest armed force in NATO. And until just a year or so ago, they were largely Turkey bound, and we didn't see them much outside of Turkey. Now, let's be intellectually honest. They were a part of NATO operations in Afghanistan and other places, but what we didn't see was Turkey on its own venturing out into missions. And now we see Turkey engaged from North Africa into the near Middle East, into Iraq, Syria, etc., etc. And so this second largest military force in NATO is now a mobile and internationally engaged force outside of NATO, outside of the rubric of NATO. And that's important. We watch with a little concern what happened to the Turkish military during the coup. A generation and a half of Turkish leadership in the military has been removed. Their loyalty was seen to be in question. And I mean, the joke is, how long does it take to make a 20-year Air Force leader? It takes 20 years to train an 20-year Air Force leader. And so now we've seen this generation and a half of leaders pulled out. And how does the Turkish military rebuild and refurbish even just its leadership post-coup? It's a challenge. There are a host of friction points. You've heard them. We're still having issues over how the Kurds are to be handled, the S-400, Turkey's on and off again relationship with Russia, Turkey's support to Azerbaijan. There are quite a few friction points. Okay, 1 minute to get off the stage to my last slide, please. So what? The last thing you want is a military guy yakking at you about problems without talking to some things that we need to do. The first and foremost, I said at the beginning of my presentation, NATO is more important now than ever. The world is more problematic than ever, and NATO has kept the relative peace in Europe for over 70 years. The investment in NATO is minuscule compared to another war in Europe. We have new tasks. We spent nearly 25 years in counterinsurgency and fighting in Afghanistan, and where our militaries changed to adapt to that. And now we need to remember that we have to be prepared for Article 5 large force employment. And while preparing ourselves and readdressing our readiness for that large-scale war, we need to be able to engage day to day in the hybrid war that is ongoing. People chaff at that when I say we're at war. They say, well, we're competing in these spaces of cyber and others, information war. I have said and been chastised, I will say again, if your enemy is fighting and you are competing, you are losing. Clausewitz said that the enemy gets a vote, and our enemy is fighting us in these spaces today. I think that all the nations of NATO need to step up to the task, and I don't like sometimes the tactics, techniques, and procedures of working on that our leadership have adopted, but I do believe that burden sharing is important, and our NATO allies need to step up to the task. We need allies. Every time the United States begins a period of isolation and retrenchment, we get into wars by avoiding them. We need allies, and the United States needs to take its leadership position. For almost 12 years, we have been backing out of the lead around the world, and we need to step up to our role. Maybe we're not the only leader, but we should be a part of leading. And I would close with what I started with. What is it worth to prevent the next world war? Okay, thank you for listening, and I'm ready to take your questions and answers.
Hey, General Breedlove, thank you very much for a typical tour de force. We have some people already typing questions into the Q&A section, so keep those coming in. I'm going to abuse my privileges as the moderator to ask a question. When you talked about the retreating ice cap in the Arctic, you spoke about how Russia and China are responding to this new situation. Could you tell us a little bit about how the US and NATO are revisualizing that part of the world?
So it is a sort of bifurcated thing. The United States, I think, is interested, but we're not really putting a lot of money and emphasis into that part of the Arctic. We're doing a good job of positioning our forces in Alaska and other places, which actually makes it faster for them to respond to Europe than when they're in America, oh, by the way. But we are doing some pieces to address the Northwest Passage, but the Northern Passage over Russia, we are a part of the Arctic Council, and we're trying to get the right things done, but we really haven't focused on it as a military challenge. Oh, by the way, Alistair, I think you know the answer. How many operational icebreakers does America have?
I have no idea. Not many.
The answer was one, but it's now broken itself and being worked on. So we right now, I think, have zero. Okay, and so how much emphasis are we putting on this part of the world? I think it's a great question. I would opine that we have work to do.
All right. So we have a couple of questions that have to do with Turkey and its relationship with NATO. So one is kind of from the perspective that Turkey is distancing itself from NATO, and the other is the issue you touched on, the S-400s and the issue and Turkey now being removed from the F-35 partner list. So what sort of do you see as the future of Turkey's relationship with NATO?
So I don't mean to be glib here, but let's just start with a premise, and that is NATO has had these kinds of issues with countries throughout its history. So the first thing I would say is don't panic. Just remember that NATO was thrown out of a NATO country, thrown out lock, stock, and barrel, and had to move to Belgium out of a country. So we're not anywhere near that right now. And so we have to work with this ally. I hope I made it clear in my slide on Turkey that Turkey is important to the West, it's important to NATO, it's important to the United States. And so this is something we need to invest in. Clearly, Mr. Erdogan has taken Turkey in a different direction, and it's caused friction, and we need to be able to work through this as an alliance and then in a bilateral way. I think that the process of moving from a secular state to a political Islam situation has really challenged things, and so those are other adaptations that we're going to have to work with. When you get to some of the particulars, the S-400, there's a long history on this S-400. The United States not wanting to release technology for the production of things like Patriots and THAADs and things like that, driving Turkey to look at Russian equipment. I think the coup is very much a contributing matter here. Remember that Mr. Erdogan especially came down hard on the Turkish Air Force. I believe that he felt like it was a major part of the coup. And many believe he wants an S-400 because he wants something that he absolutely controls in case his own Air Force goes against him again. A NATO piece he might not be able to use the way he might want to use it if he came under attack by his very own Air Force. And so there are a lot of possibilities out there of why the S-400 became such an important thing. I would like to see Turkey and the United States settle into much more fruitful conversations about how NATO compatible weapons could be bought and used. As the AirCom commander and the U-Safety commander before I became the SACEUR, it was clear, and it remains clear to every AirCom and U-Safety commander after that, we're not going to plug an S-400 into NATO systems. All the back doors of an S-400 that goes straight to Russia and the ability then to test their radars against our aircraft. There's a whole myriad of reasons that we'll never do that. And so it's something we're going to have to work out. We would want our ally, our great ally of Turkey, to fly the most advanced fifth generation airplane flying today. We actually were enjoying co-production in a lot of ways until this all hit. And now we have economic loss on the Turkish side and opportunity loss on the Western side to have an ally in an important program. So I would just say that we need to continue to work on this. Don't panic. It's not as bad as it's ever been, and Turkey is worth the effort.
Sort of pivoting off that, there's a question about what NATO can do to sort of address the bad behavior of members. And this question was asked in the context specifically of Turkey being sort of taking what actions that might be seen as sort of contrary to the rest of the alliance. But the issue's also been raised in the context of democratic backsliding in Hungary and Poland. So what is the responsibility of NATO and even the capacity of NATO to try and make its members behave better?
So I will offer some opinions, and then I will tell a short story. I'm not going to use the names because I'm not sure what we're doing here as far as academic freedom and on the record versus off the record. But the bottom line is, I've been asked, how do you kick somebody out of NATO? And I don't know, because I don't think there's any provisions in the Atlantic Charter to do that. And I don't think there's any intention to develop those things. I have seen myself, since I've really been serving in NATO since '85, when Captain Breedlove first went over to serve with the U.S. Army in Germany. And before that, in early '84, as a pilot at La Besa Real de Torrejón in España. And so I have seen the perturbations of some of the nations in NATO. And what always happens is NATO self-regulates and self-polices in most of these matters. And it is an alliance based on consensus, meaning we need 100% to make a decision. And so the method forever and ever is that when you have an issue come before NATO, for me it was 28 nations, all 28 nations show up at the first meeting, and it's their nation first and foremost and their position first and foremost. And then over the course of time, we rapidly work that down into a consensus agreement. And that is done in the old-fashioned ways. Nations working with other nations. The Baltic nations pay a lot of attention to Germany and Poland, and the southern nations pay a lot of attention to France and to Spain. And there are formal and informal leaderships that work inside of NATO that bring the alliance to consensus. And that is the way we typically police when we're having troubles. I'm not going to name names, but remember during the financial crisis several years ago, some of our nations were in real trouble. And we saw Russia trying to weasel into the cracks and pry us apart using their money and their influence to, here's a place we can divide NATO. And NATO, and to a certain degree the EU, which we share 24 or 25 nations now, bringing them back together. And so it's that. And let me just point out to you that, NATO has a series of meetings, ministerials that start with the chiefs of defense, ministers of defense, ministers of foreign affairs, and then at the summit level with the presidents and prime ministers of the nations. At one of those very senior meetings, I saw this process work. We had a nation that was being extremely problematic and looked like it was going to delay a decision at the most senior level of NATO. And I saw one North American continent nation and 3 European continent nations and island nations, the leaders of those 4 nations take this other nation's leader over into the corner, not even out of sight, into the corner in the NAC room. And I saw NATO at work, and we got past that problem pretty quickly. And so that's the way NATO works. We're not about kicking people out. We're about helping people to get to the right place. And I think that's what we need to really work on now. Oh, by the way, with Turkey.
Thank you. So there are a couple of questions that play on the issue of burden sharing in slightly different directions. So one is that burden sharing and issues with European burden sharing are not new, but the question asks, but what do the European allies bring to NATO? And the second question is, does has the process of the U.S. disengagement with Europe that you alluded to over the past 12 years, does that, particularly if it continues into the future, create the space for the Europeans to take more ownership of NATO?
Well, I'm just making myself a note here so I don't lose myself in the question. So I'm going to sound like I'm talking out both sides of my mouth, but this has been a consistent message that I have actually given in testimony before the SASC when I was still in uniform, and my story hasn't changed since that time. The bottom line is burden sharing is absolutely important. And why? Let's remember that for 20 plus years, we were trying to hug the bear. We were trying to bring Russia into the Western fold. We were hoping to get Russia to adopt more Western values and become a contributing part of a vibrant world economy and certainly European economy. We had 2008. And many just said, okay, this is an aberration. It's a speck. It's get over it. Let's get back to hugging the bear and bringing Russia towards us. And then we saw in 2014 twice Russia using its military force to change internationally recognized borders. And so we now begin to understand that Russia was never really interested in hugging us or coming towards us. So during these years, of course, we're in Afghanistan. And it's post the fall of the wall. And so nations were taking massive peace dividends, downsizing their militaries, allowing their readiness to atrophy, allowing their equipment to atrophy. And we were focused on just filling a military need in Afghanistan, and we had the whole alliance to do that. And so nations were very comfortable with their military establishments very much diminishing in capability and readiness. And so now, in the spring of 14, when we again see Russia using its military force to change internationally recognized borders twice, it comes to us now that we are not where we wanted to be or thought we were, and we need to re-examine our ability to do large force capabilities, Article 5 operations, our ability to deter, and so forth. And we have let that atrophy over 25 years. So all of this is to explain that investment and burden sharing is important because we have to buy back 20 plus years of letting our militaries atrophy. I'm not going to name names, but 8 assignments in Europe. I served alongside of one of the proudest and most capable militaries I've ever seen in my life. And that military has had trouble moving relatively small groups of capability around in our recent past. And so we have come a long way, and we have got a long way to correct it. And so burden sharing and the 20% investment in kit that's part of the burden sharing is important. Okay, That's out the left side of my mouth. Now let me talk a little bit about out the right side of my mouth. We need to be intellectually honest and understand that it's more than just the budget that is concerning here. And I like to tell a story. There's stories all across NATO, so don't think I'm picking on some and thanking others. But the easiest way to tell this story is in the North Med. In the North Med, the nations starting in Spain, going all the way to Greece, and to a certain degree Turkey still, but certainly Turkey a lot in the past, have allowed NATO forces and, frankly, in bilateral senses, have allowed U.S. forces to move rapidly around in there to handle problems. I used the U.S. response to Benghazi. We were not capable in responding correctly to Benghazi. Physics is physics. Airplanes fly at a certain speed, and it takes a certain amount of time for them to fly. Ships steam at a certain speed, and it takes a certain amount of time. And so we have built in the United States a rapid reaction capability that's based out of Spain, but it moves around in the North Med as we see hotspots in Africa to allow us to more rapidly respond into Africa if required. I liken this to, okay, let's just say, how do you think the governors of Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi would respond if a bunch of foreigners showed up and said, we need to move around your bases all the time to do our mission? How do you think that will work? Probably not very smoothly. But what we have is NATO allies allowing us to do the things we do militarily from their fields and ports, and sometimes on less than a day's notice, moving forces around to be better positioned and prepared for things that are happening in the Med and on the North Shores in Africa. And so I think there's some intangibles that all the nations of NATO give us that are hard to measure. And so when I talk about burden sharing, I don't take the heat off of we need to invest because we spent 25 years of peace dividend. We don't fix that in 2 years, okay? You don't fix 25 years of peace dividend with 2 years of investment. We got to keep on it. But on the other side, I say it's more than just the dollars. These nations are allowing us to be on their soil. In Germany, we would never have been able to do Afghanistan without Ramstein and Spangdahlem in the throughput areas, and the hospital at Landstuhl saved thousands and thousands of lives, not only American lives, but all of our allies. And so the intangible contributions of these nations also have to be a part of our calculus. I'm sorry for being on my soapbox there, but I think it's important to understand that it's more than just the 2% absolute measurement.
And that was a fulsome answer to the first part of the question. The second piece is to do with what does the U.S. Sort of disengagement create space for the Europeans to step up?
That was not by mistake. I was hoping to avoid this. But I will talk to this. And I don't mince my words here. And again, I'm trying not to be political. So I'm not criticizing anything. But for 12 years, and if you look at that, that's a couple of administrations. For 12 years, we have been disengaging from leadership in places like this. We have leaders who want to close wars, not open them. I completely understand that. I sign up to that. But we also need to understand that nature abhors a vacuum. And when a power like the United States pulls back from an issue, others are going to fill in, and they may not be in the same place that we are. So I think that we need to be considerate and deliberate in where we begin to re-engage in leadership processes. Maybe Minsk in Ukraine would work a lot better if the United States were involved. Maybe Minsk in Nagorno-Karabakh would work a lot better if we were more actively involved. And I applaud what the current administration has tried to do in the last 4 or 5 days. But Are we doing the right things? Are we building the right coalitions? Are we bringing people together? Will we consider sitting down at the table with Russia to try to build something that people would see would be more durable if it was both of us involved, et cetera, et cetera? And so I'm not a fan of disengaging. We have an important role to play. We are not the world's police, and there are a couple of other huge, important nations and economies out there that absolutely we need to be alongside as we try to lead these kinds of issues. And I believe that the role that we have played for the first drastic amount of NATO success in Europe is something to be very proud of.
Thank you. Okay, I have a question here. You've mentioned Afghanistan a couple of times. I'm going to read this question because I'm not sure I understand it. Let's see if you can make more sense of it than I can. So it's requesting your thoughts on the conflict in Afghanistan and its impact on future battle space planning.
Okay, I don't know what exactly they're asking. Let me try to answer it in two ways. Maybe the question could be retyped with some clarification. Future battle space planning. Well, let's talk about one thing. When was the last time we fought a war of this size at a completely landlocked nation? How we got into and out of Afghanistan changes logistics in an incredible way. Building land bridges through formerly pretty uncooperative nations, building air bridges flying through formerly uncooperative nations, relying on airlift in a way that we've never relied on airlift before. The vulnerability of land routes through very challenged territory, et cetera, et cetera. So battle space inside a landlocked nation is tough. We're thinking a lot about China now, about how you fight a war at that great distance, et cetera, et cetera. And so these are important. Secondarily, I think that what we learned in Afghanistan is the absolute requirement for and the dominating capability that networks bring to the battlefield. Remember that we in counterinsurgency we took militaries that were ready during the Cold War to fight massive formations. And in Afghanistan, after the initial sort of very kinetic conflict, which resolved relatively quickly if you think about big force on big force, but it turns now into a counterinsurgency fight. And our militaries had to adapt this machine into a machine that could hit very precisely, very quickly, and be discreet about it. Everybody concerned about the collateral damage that was being caused and the focus from the world on the fact that civilians were dying. Remember, tens of thousands, millions of civilians dying in World War I and World War II. But now we're worried about 2 or 3, and rightfully so. I'm not denigrating that. But the fact of the matter is we took military machines, turned them into rapid, precise striking capability that are absolutely focused on diminishing civilian casualties. And we built pretty elaborate law and rule structures on CIVCAS, what is allowed and what is not, and how it is adjusted, and by who in the leadership chain, all the way to the White House, adjusts those tolerability factors on CIVCAS. So what we developed is amazing networks where we tie the very best intelligence to rapid targeting, to rapid employment by aircraft, helicopters, or ground-fired munitions that are precise, and we took all of that and applied it in a battle space that's pretty dang big and pretty different. I'll just give you one success story of this. You know, for a long time, fighters have carried precise weapons to drop to support the ground troops and to hit these counterinsurgency targets. One of the most popular aircraft during the Afghan war by the tactical air control parties on the ground was the B-1, designed to be a strategic nuclear bomber. Because when the B-1 showed up, it had over 60 weapons and carried sometimes 4 or 5 different fusing operations. We called it Burger King. Have it your way. I want this weapon to go off at this altitude and take off this number of floors on the southwest corner of this building, rather than rubblize the city, which is what you saw Bashar al-Assad doing in Syria. I rambled, sorry.
All right, great. So, we have time for one last question, and this sort of picks up on a couple of things. I mean, China has come up several times, and you talked about Russia seeking to exploit the global financial crisis to pry NATO apart. To what extent is there concern within NATO about the Belt and Road Initiative and China's investments in particularly sort of East European members of Eastern and Southeastern European members of NATO for NATO's cohesiveness?
So I think the easiest and first answer is we have some deep security concerns. As we see Huawei creeping into these nations and understanding that Huawei is a tool of the Chinese government and will feed back everything that is traveling on Huawei goes back to China. Remember that China has developed over the last few years a way to absolutely monitor their public. And in monitoring their public, literally, and I'm grossly simplifying here, breaking the loyalty of their public and then rewarding them in jobs and compensation based on their loyalty to the party. And all of these software platforms and all of this hardware is all built to enable that government's ability to reach down and measure and control its population. We don't need that in the West. We don't need Huawei kit that is going to filter back data about our nations, our militaries, back to Russia. And so the first and foremost concern is to make sure that we understand where Huawei is, where these Chinese kit are, and be able to understand then what that means to exfil of data back to China. So if you have any confusion about how I feel about Huawei, we can answer that. The second thing to talk about is, frankly, that China is smart. They bet the long game. We talk about this all the time. And they're investing in infrastructures that would be incredibly important to our alliance if we were to have to employ in a region. If we need a port and it's 75% controlled by Chinese due to Belt and Road Initiative, we may not get the access we need. If the road and railroad infrastructure is owned or at least majority holdings by Chinese, we may not get the access that we need. Airports, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it's important that we understand that China, in a very straightforward way, is investing. And as they invest, they buy influence. And sometimes that influence, sometime in the future, that influence could very much work to our detriment. And so we need to be taking the same kind of view they do, a long view, a geostrategic view of these various infrastructure that could come under the control of Chinese interests.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us again. We are now out of time. And as ever, it was extremely rich and engaging. So thank you very much. I'm sure the audience joins me in thanking you, but one of the disadvantages of this remote world is that you can't actually hear the appreciation, but I'm sure it is. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Alistair. Good to see you again. Good to see the whole audience, and follow up with me at Georgia Tech if you think I'm crazy.